The fifth plenum of the 19th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China will be held in Beijing next week. In that meeting, the 14th five-year plan for economic and social development will be assessed. How different will this session be? How has the ongoing 13th five-year plan been implemented? And what can be expected for the next five-year plan? To talk about these issues and more, I'm pleased to be joined by Li Yong. He's a senior fellow of the China Association of International Trade. Professor Jun Qian, Executive Dean of the Fanhai International School of Finance at Fudan University, and Harvey Zodin, Senior Fellow from the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. And everybody say that the year 2020 is a transitional year, both for China, probably the world. For China, economically, it is because we will wrap up the 13th five-year plan and also make plans for the next 5 years. But first of all, Mr. Li, what is your assessment of the implementation of the 13th five-year plan?
I think China has been doing pretty well with the the 13th five-year plan. Some of the targets set in the five-year plan has been achieved in advance. Some of them just on time. And some of the targets actually is transitional, which means that some of the targets will go beyond the 13th.
Can you be more specific? What has achieved ahead of time?
Like poverty reduction. I think some of the poverty reduction goal has achieved. Even though we still have 5 million, and some of the environmental targets have been achieved. And energy consumption efficiency, those are the targets that have been achieved, and on a kind of ongoing basis, as you can see, the employment targets have been achieved on a year by year basis, and the rate of inflation have been controlled almost every year. And those are the I think are the achievements. So we can say with confidence that we have the 13th five-year plan has laid a solid foundation for the country to move on to the next five-year plan. Even though we are facing a quite complex. Both international situation and domestic situations as well, because they are kind of interrelated and having impact on each other.
And the COVID is a big disruptor. Because of COVID, China's economic growth will probably stay at around 2%, and that's a big surprise before when the planners made plans 5 years ago.
Yes, this COVID thing is really a kind of an unexpected disruptor, and that is one of the main factors I think that the next 5 years is going to take into consideration, because this is going to change the manufacturing behavior. It is going to change, I think, the landscape of the domestic economy as well as international economy, because the pandemic has disrupted the normal economic changes, relations between China and the rest of the world. And basically in China, because the COVID-19 has been brought under control, so domestically I think the kind of interactions between manufacturers as well as suppliers and consumers are now returning to normal. But we are not really looking at China alone, because China is in the context of the global economy. So basically we will have to take that factor into consideration when we are planning for the next year, because next 5 year, it is going to be a plan in terms of how China should interact with the rest of the world, given the situation of the pandemic given the changes that have already taken place, given the expected changes that may likely happen, and to have an impact on China's own economic growth.
And Professor Chen, qualitatively, China probably have delivered on many targets, but quantitatively, what do you think of the progress in terms of economic structuring and better financial regulation and stability?
I think it's important to point out that the reason why China sets these 5-year plans, right? So you can't plan for everything. So it's important to understand that, first of all, a lot of these targets are overall economic growth targets. Big sectoral changes, targets on big sectoral changes, are not very micro-based, right? Because you can't plan ahead about what each firm will be doing. So keep that in mind. Second of all, I agree with Mr. Lee, what has said. I would add that still one of the most important target is still on economic growth at the GDP level, but also at the per capita income level. And I think for both targets, as long as there's going to be growth this year of more than 1%, and I'm also in the camp that I think the growth will be around 2% or more, the overall GDP growth target will be reached. The other thing is that if you look at the per capita income level, it's going to be exceeding the $10,000 barrier, if you will. So that's very important. In terms of sectoral changes, we've already seen a lot of things happening. You mentioned financial markets, very important breakthroughs such as the STAR market board that's going to continue to change the financial sector, the stock market. Environmental change. I actually came back to China, moved back to China from the U.S. 7 years ago. Even without reading the data, if you just look at the air quality, clearly there have been a lot of further improvement from 5 years ago, from 7 years ago. So I think overall, if you look at the most important overall targets, they have already been met or will be met as long as there's going to be reasonable growth this year. And any growth this year will be, for a large economy like China, is going to be a very difficult task to accomplish. So all of that is very satisfactory. And again, that just set the stage for the next 5-year plan, where I think the central theme is we're going to continue this shift from high-speed growth to better quality growth.
And Harvey, what does China's growth mean for the rest of the world? And also the structure of China's economic change mean for the rest of the world?
Well, you have to look at the numbers for the economy right now and see that China is really the engine of the global economy because of COVID. So what's happening in China doesn't just stay in China, it affects the rest of the world. China's economy, under the circumstances, under COVID, is growing quite well. The big problem is that demand from outside is not growing. And so, therefore, China's going to have to implement the dual circulation model, which is basically a continuation of the supply side structural reforms that President Xi started several years ago.
And Mr. Lee, the 14th 5-year plan, that will probably focus on a lot of the agendas that China will face in the next decade.
Right.
What would be the focus of this plan?
I think the focus plan is going to be the new model. I think that China will probably be operating on
economic
model in the next 5 years, particularly when we're expecting the change of the so-called the so-called the big picture of the circulations domestic and international. So this is really something that we need to weigh in on, because those are the factors that will, I think, fundamentally change both the way that China will operate, and as well as the outside world, how they are going to operate.
You kept saying complicated, but what I want to say is that it is probably also fluid, because everything might change. American trade policy might change. International COVID control situation might change. How can China plan for such an uncertain world?
Yes, this is really a very good question, because we will have to look at what will be the controllable and manageable factors. Okay, and there are some factors within China that are going to be controllable, manageable, and because they are controllable and manageable, they can be predictable. And there are also uncontrollable factors, I think, that that will require China and other partners or other players in the world economy, that will need a kind of an interaction. Okay, need a kind of a collaborative effort, for the stakeholders, to really work out a kind of a workable cooperative framework, or a kind of a path that will stabilize the relationship, because China can be a stabilizer, and how the other players or economic actors are going to, for example, to tap on the stabilizer or on the stabilizing economic development. That is really a question, how this world is going to evolve with a certain level of stability and the effort to manage the instability, uncertainty. So those are the challenges, I think, that will require, I would say, cooperation, a kind of a dialogue, and effort to design a kind of a cooperative framework, for China and the rest of the world to work together.
And Professor Chen, it seems to many that domestic circulation is more reliable because we have more control here at home. But is China's market and supply big enough to support its growth down the road?
So as we say, it's true that one of the strengths that China has is that the domestic market is very big. Consumption is very big. Domestic markets and consumption should be a strong enough engine to pull China's growth. But on the other hand, it's also very important that China's economy is very deeply integrated into the rest of the world. If anything COVID shows is that the global supply chain is a very integrated system, where if one place has some problem, stoppage, it's going to affect production everywhere. Also, we've seen that the China's status in the global supply chain is actually very strong. So it's very important, as you mentioned, we are facing so many uncertainties. Hopefully some of that uncertainty will be resolved in a few weeks by looking at the U.S. election. We'll see. But facing so many uncertainties, so it's important on a strategy-wise, we have two, right? We have the domestic circulation, but we also have the international circulation. I want to also point out that if you look at the trade data for first half of this year, the largest trading partner with China, import and export combined, is not Europe, it's not the US, but rather Southeast Asian economies. Also, if you add up Korea and Japan, those two countries plus China, that's a very large trading bloc. So I think it's actually very important to maintain a balanced approach of both domestic but also global trade bloc, if you will. Certainly within that, there are constant changes, as I mentioned. The trading partners may be changing, and depending on the resolution of uncertainty in the U.S., we'll see how China-U.S. relationship, economic relationship, will recover or what.
Harvey, I want your take on this. Mr. Qian seems to suggest that the change of power in Washington might result in a better or different policy for China. But others say it is only wishful thinking because structure matters. The U.S. will push back against China, who has gained more political economic power and say in the world stage.
I think that if Trump wins again, that we might as well start building bomb shelters and put all our assets into that, because he's going to be unfettered, and there'll be more policies like we've had the last 4 years, but they'll be worse in many ways. Biden is much more of an open question, I would say. I like the fact that his key foreign policy advisor, Tony Blinken, said, it's true that we're in a competition with China, but he'd much rather see it as a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. And so I believe that in the areas where our national interests overlap, that we can have some cooperation in things like climate change and disease prevention and things like that. And we used to have these economic and political and cybersecurity dialogues every year between China and U.S. Trump stopped that. But I believe at least we'll be talking together again. And when we talk together, there's a good chance that we could resolve a number, not all, but a number of these issues. So what I see differently in the Trump administration is they have no way of devising policy except what Trump thinks. But in the Biden administration, we'll go back more to a reasoned economic, political, foreign policy that's done by experts and not by seat-of-the-pants thoughts.
But in the eyes of the Chinese, the metrics of American reasonable has changed. It seems that there is a bipartisan support in the U.S. that China is a threat, is an opponent, is undermining Americans' power, at least in the field of tech. It seems that the Chinese tech companies will have a very hard time in the coming decade if they want to go global.
Yes, I think, whoever is going to win the election, I don't think, this picture is going to change over time. At least, not really in a kind of a recent future. Because, the nature of the relationship has been defined, in basically, for example, in the U.S. security strategy document, and in various other documents being drafted during the Trump administration. And those, I think, basically, represent the basic sentiment, from the political circle of the United States. So if Biden is going to win, probably his approach to this U.S.-China relation and or China-U.S. relationship is going to be different, but I think it is going to not really change, the general definition of the relationship. The difference will be for, however, like how to deal with the tariff, how to deal with the technological challenge, which is really very important in terms of the future shake-up of the relationship between the two countries, and as well as the role that China will play, as well as the role that U.S. is going to play. That is going to be a problem. And if you look, for example, one of the advocates of Joe Biden, which is made in all America. So if he is going to pursue that kind of a policy, I think, whoever the experts, whoever the think tanks, probably they are going to try to think in that kind of direction, even though this may change because, some of the economic realities, will challenge, the ideas because, you need to respect some of the basic rules like, free flow of trade and investment, efficiency, the competitive principles and so on. And all of those, will
be challenged.
Yes, will challenge the political distortion. Probably will have some kind of a correction.
Harvey, you disagree?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes, I disagree.
Good.
I disagree to an extent. I disagree because in a presidential election, it's usually the case that people bash China, both sides or all sides bash China. But after, if it's a reasonable candidate, they return to a more reasonable policy. And I believe that, there's going to be some tough issues, but I believe those issues are more geopolitical, like South China Sea and Taiwan, for example. I think some of these other issues, like the tech issues, can be addressed, and I think there's certainly issues, like I said, like climate change, for example, and preventing the next pandemic, which people tell us is sure to come, that we can work together on. So I'm not optimistic, but I'm not pessimistic. I think there's room where our interests overlap and we can work on those.
And Professor Qian, I talked to some American think tank members. They also think that there is a high chance that we will see a decoupled world, especially in high tech. For example, in the field of artificial intelligence, robotics, and 5G. That's not going to happen. We're going to see a more integrated world, but a fractured world.
I do believe that we'll see both. On the one hand, there will be, unfortunately, there will be some decoupling in some sectors. High tech is one of them. And again, from the economic efficiency point of view, that's not very good. But
No.
there is a high chance of that happening, no matter who wins the White House. On the other hand, though, I do agree with Harvey that there are so many other things that tie China and the U.S. together. There's this massive sector called consumption, Starbucks, McDonald's. I mean, they're doing Tesla. All of these sectors, the global supply chain, as I said, is very integrated. It's actually very costly, as we've seen in the pandemic. It's very costly to completely decouple. Because it's not only about moving the factory out of China. You have to set up essentially the entire supply chain. That takes years and a lot of money. So there are a lot of areas in the economic and trade. There's this massive scale of services and consumption that we can continue to do better. As Harvey said, there are all these very important tasks that only these two superpowers work together. We can solve environmental challenges facing the planet, so in that regard, I'm more optimistic that the two countries will work together, especially with Biden.
Let's come back to our domestic economic scaling up. What are the most important growth points that we can look at, apart from consumption-driven, technology-driven, urbanization? Which is the most important driving force?
I think, we need to look at the so-called new infrastructure and new urbanization and important projects. I think those are the three elements that we will see some sort of a planning in the new 5-year plan.
That will depend a lot on the investment from the government.
Not just the government, but also private sector, because private sector, they have especially investment funds, they are ready to find opportunities, especially like the 5G infrastructure.
So it's a coming together of private and public funds.
Exactly, industrial, internet, AI, and so on. Like IDC, digitalization of manufacturing or businesses. All of them will represent a completely new opportunities, for participants or for players of the market, to tap on, in the next 5 years. And this will also attract, I think, global investors to come to China, because this is really a kind of environment. It is a place that the market is big enough, for them to really come to invest, on their own or work with the domestic partners. That will give them, I think, a relatively predictable picture for the future investment, especially as compared with places, that may have some sort of uncertainties because of the, the pandemic problems, because of the relatively smaller size of the economy. So this is really where I'm pretty optimistic, because people are talking about internal circulation and also external circulation. I just came out of a seminar actually today, and no one has ruled out the further opening up of the country to embrace foreign investors and to welcome them to really to get the benefit of the stable economic environment and the market potential.
And COVID, I want to ask you this, because many people say COVID will fracture manufacturing around the world. It will become more localized. Like Mr. Lee said, well, probably with China's support for high-tech and artificial intelligence, manufacturing will become more localized in China, inside China. Is that something you will look forward to? Harvey?
Yeah, well, I'd say yes, but there is the other position, which is a complete decoupling. But I'm a firm believer in the middle position. And the middle position is, instead of just in time, just in case. So to maintain a substantial stockpile and to cooperate with the global community, I think is the middle way. And I believe that the middle way is the best way to go, because I don't see in our modern globalized world that we can completely decouple and go back to the 19th century. It's just not going to work.
It seems, Professor Chen, you also agree we should stick to the middle way, do not go to one extreme or the other.
I do. Certainly, what companies are doing now is not decoupling, but backup, right? It's like insurance. So we probably will see more of that. I want to add one more thing to what Mr. Lee said about important things about the next 5-year plan. Finance. So the new infrastructure is important. I want to talk about how to finance that, right? So I think one of the important goals for the financial system, for the domestic Chinese financial system, is to further increase the share of what we call direct financing. That is financing through equity and through the bond market.
All right.
After 40 years,
we cannot elaborate on that. We're running out of time. Direct financing, obviously, is something we should talk about later on. Thank you very much, Chen. Thank you, Harvey, and thank you, Mr. Lee. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zhu in Beijing. Goodbye.